Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Google Pixel 7 Pro and see how this phone holds up in 2025. Now, the thing I would definitely tell you about the Google Pixel 7 Pro is that the hardware of this phone, like the exterior, when I'm picking up this phone and kind of messing around with it, this is such a good feeling phone still. This phone still feels like $1,000 phone, and there are some areas where this phone may not hold up the best, but I'm still a massive fan of this phone, and if you're in the market, I would highly recommend buying this type of device for sure. However, there are probably some other phones I would still recommend buying too, and I will leave those types of phones linked down in the description below, where you can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Google Pixel 7 Pro, this phone came out in 2022. So it's turning 3 years old this year, and it's giving you a 6.7-inch LTPO AMOLED display. Now, the thing I can definitely tell you about this type of device for the most part is that this type of phone is still going to be giving you a really good experience for the most part. This type of device still looks great. I feel like if you're going to go through and buy a phone, like this panel itself is very good. It's, an LTPO AMOLED display, 120 Hz. It does peak out at 1500 nits of brightness, which isn't like the brightest panel of all time, but I guess it's still decent. But I love this phone because it gives you this curved glass on the sides, which I've always kind of liked, and a hole punch display too. So this thing still looks very good. It's, one of the best, it's still like it's a design that doesn't really get old. Even 10 years from now, we're going to look at this phone and be like, wow, this one still looks really good. So kind of keep that in mind. On the bottom, you are getting a USB Type-C port on this phone, which is always really good to have. You're getting an aluminum frame, you're getting your standard glass back on the back of this phone with a triple camera setup. So this phone from that side still looks and feels very, very good. You're getting wireless charging on this phone with reverse wireless charging. And definitely if you're going to go through and pick up a phone, like I mentioned, this is still a phone that's going to feel very, very good, right? It's still going to feel like a very good phone. It's still going to look like a very good phone. I will say though, when the Pixel 8s did come out, I did kind of like those ones a little bit more, but the Google Pixel 7 Pro, for the most part on the exterior, still looks and feels very, very good. But there are some things about this phone that are kind of lacking that a majority of flagships, the successors of this phone basically have. Number one, it's basically a higher, brightness on the front panel. This phone's panel is still fairly bright, not too many issues there, but most phones nowadays do give you like 2600 nits of brightness on the Galaxy S25, but even like 3000 nits of brightness on the current generation Pixels. So you are kind of missing out on some things there. Although it's not the biggest deal in the world, you are getting noticeably much brighter panels in this day and age. On top of that, something that I always kind of look out for, this phone is essentially kind of missing out on on some sort of frosted glass back. I personally love frosted glass backs. I think they make the phone feel that much more premium and that much more just capable. Unfortunately, with this phone, you aren't really getting that type of capability. So that is kind of an unfortunate thing. Again, it's not really the biggest deal in the world, but you might end up experiencing that within this device, that it might not feel as good compared to some of the competition. So when it comes down to that side, those are kind of the big things to keep in mind there. Now, on top of that, some other big things to keep in mind is the price tag. The price of this phone right now is much cheaper than what it originally came out with. When this phone first came out, it was like over $1,000 or around $1,000. Right now, this phone costs about $233 on Amazon. So that is a very, very cheap price to pay for a device like this once again. If you're going to go through and pick up a phone, well, it's really nice to be able to buy a phone like this that's not going to cost that much money. So it still might be a little bit of a pricey phone depending on who you are. But in my personal opinion, I think this is a really, really good price to pay for a phone like this when it comes down to it. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. But when it comes down to the cameras, this phone is giving you a triple camera setup on the backside, a 50 megapixel wide, 48 megapixel periscope telephoto, and then a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. And it's also giving you a 10.8 megapixel ultra-wide camera on the front side. Now, in my personal opinion, when it does kind of come down to the camera side on this phone, this is a very decent camera for the age of this phone. Now, I don't think this was the best camera of that year, so I do just want to get that out of the way. I think the iPhones and the Galaxies of that year had better cameras than this thing, but still not like a super terrible camera by any means at all. Now, when you take a look at this camera, you're getting 4K at 60 on the front and the back of this phone, which is always nice to have. I love having that type of resolution to film in, and if you want to, you can just pick up this phone and get that type of resolution in and of itself, and it's still pretty good, but this is where this phone kind of starts showing its age a little bit. A majority of phones nowadays can film in 8K. A lot of the Pixels nowadays, the newest ones, can film in 8K as well. And although it's not the biggest deal in the world, that could be one specific thing that you might run into here when you're kind of doing this comparison thing, where the newer phones can give you a better experience than this thing. So again, it's not the biggest deal in the world, but that could easily be one other thing to kind of keep in mind here when you're going through and picking up this device when it comes down to it. Now, on top of that, another very big thing to keep in mind here too is the software longevity. Now, this phone was basically promised to get 5 major versions of Android upgrades. It started off with Android 13. We're now at like Android 15, and I'm sure at some point we're going to be getting Android 16. This phone is probably going to end off around Android 18 or 17, something like that. So this thing still has probably like another 2 years of software support, which is actually very nice to have. So it's going to last the remainder of this year and next year, and maybe even the year after that. And I think that'd be another really cool thing to kind of think about there too. So when you are getting a phone, any device in this day and age, it's very important to buy a phone that's still supported with software. And that's why a device like this, even though it's not perfect, it still is kind of doing a pretty decent job for the most part, in terms of software support. And it's on stock Android, so that's going to be another really cool thing to keep in mind there too. Now, with battery, this phone was giving you a 5,000 mAh battery, but I've always felt like these batteries haven't really been like the best tailored for these devices. Especially with this phone nowadays, you have to remember that this is about a 3-year-old phone or turning 3 years old this year. So this phone's battery is going to be degraded a little bit. So if you don't want to have a battery that's going to be degraded a little bit, you're going to have to go through and buy a new one. And I doubt anybody's selling a brand new Pixel 7 Pro. And if they are, it's probably might be like a collector's item. So I might think that might be one thing to keep in mind. It's a big size battery for sure, but just because of the chipset and the way this phone's optimized, it may not be the best type of, it might not be the most optimized phone when it comes down to it, if that makes sense. However, the performance is also one of those things that can be a hit or miss for some people. This phone is basically giving you that Google Tensor G2 chipset inside with 8 or 12 gigabytes of RAM. I believe the model I had 8 gigs of RAM, and the RAM side is totally fine. If it taps out at 12, that's still very good. The chipset was always the thing that I was a little bit worried about, because I always felt like that chipset, with it having like that, Tensor G2 chipset, it really wasn't that great of, of a chipset, to be honest, when compared to the competition of that year. When compared to the iPhone 14 Pro or against the, the Galaxy S22. The S22 was different. That one had the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 that really wasn't that optimized either. But I think the G2 chipset was, cleaner. It was not as funky as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, and it still performed well. But with the tasks that I wanted it to compete with, in terms of like emulation and all that, it just never really was that good. But for the most part, it's not terrible. But I don't think I would recommend the Pixel 7 Pro from a performance side phone, but it's still not bad. But then that begs the question, what would I recommend for the Pixel 7 Pro? Well, I think this is actually a very decent phone for the price tag. I think if you're going to go through and like buy a phone, this thing is not a terrible option. Like this thing still holds up fairly well. It doesn't really look that bad. And I do think if you are going to go through and pick up a phone, this really isn't that terrible of an option for the most part. But with that being said, I do think there might be some other options out there that I would probably recommend more so than this phone. I think a Pixel 8 Pro would be a really good option for the most part. I also do think a Galaxy S23 would be another very good option too. I feel like those types of devices make a lot more sense to go and buy than this one. That's not to say that this is a bad phone. Like I still think this is a very good phone. I just think there might be some other better ones that I would probably recommend buying before I would buy this one. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, not me so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.